7 Israelis. A parking garage in Buenos Aires, March 1994. One of them notices the car first. Parked wrong, engine running, no driver. In the time it takes to process that, the doors open. They don't remember much after that. Hoods, zip ties, the smell of something chemical. When they wake up, they are in a basement. There is a camera on a tripod pointed at their faces, and a man standing in front of them who speaks Spanish with a Lebanese accent, telling them they have 36 hours. 36 hours before what, he doesn't say. He doesn't need to. Here is the thing about that camera, though. The thing that nobody who reported on this story noticed for years. The thing that intelligence officers didn't piece together until it was too late. The camera was never turned on. In 4 months, 85 people will die in this city. And the men who took those 7 Israelis in a parking garage will have something to do with it. But the rescue that Mossad pulled off in 36 hours, the one that made headlines, the one that every Israeli newspaper celebrated, the rescue may have been the worst thing that happened to the Jewish community of Buenos Aires in 1994. Stay with me. Hey, quick pause before we continue. This is a brand new channel, and I'm just getting started. If what you're watching right now is the kind of Jewish history you've been looking for, honest, deep, and told the way it deserves to be told, please subscribe. It literally takes 1 second, it costs you nothing, and it's the single most powerful signal you can send to the YouTube algorithm that this content is worth pushing to more people. More subscribers means more people find this history, and that's the whole point. So hit subscribe, like the video, drop a comment below. I read every single one. And let's get straight back to the story. To understand what happened in Buenos Aires in 1994, you have to understand what Buenos Aires meant to Jews. Not what it means now, what it meant then. Argentina, by the early 1990s, had the 5th largest Jewish population in the world. 250,000 people. Some of the oldest Sephardic families in the Western Hemisphere had roots there. Jews who arrived before the 20th century even began, who built synagogues and schools and newspapers and community centers, and something that most diaspora Jews will recognize and ache for: the feeling that this place was actually home. The AMIA, the Asociación Mutual Israelita Argentina, was not just a building. It was the institutional heart of Argentine Jewish life. A mutual aid society founded in 1914 by Ashkenazi immigrants who had nothing when they arrived and built everything from scratch. By the 90s, it housed community archives, employment services, a library, a cultural center. On any given weekday morning, hundreds of people passed through its doors. It was, by any definition, the kind of place you do not think of as a target. That is the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is what Argentina meant geopolitically in 1994. This is where most documentaries about the AMIA bombing start vague and stay vague, and I am not going to do that to you. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Iran needed new friends, and Argentina, which had a civilian nuclear program, matters Argentina was willing to sell, and a government that was, let us be honest, not known for its rigorous enforcement of international sanctions, was an attractive partner. In 1992, there had already been a bombing. The Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. 29 people killed. Hezbollah, acting as Iran's operational arm. The investigation went nowhere. The perpetrators were never brought to justice. The Argentine government, under President Carlos Menem, had complicated financial entanglements with Iran that investigators would spend the next 2 decades trying to fully document. The Jewish community of Argentina knew all of this. They were not naive. They had security protocols. They had relationships with Argentine intelligence. They had back channels to Israeli intelligence. What they did not know What nobody knew yet was that the men who would bomb the AMIA in July of 1994 were already in Buenos Aires. And in March of that same year, 4 months before the bombing, some of those men were in a parking garage watching 7 Israeli tourists get into a car. So why did they need 7 Israeli tourists? What was a kidnapping supposed to accomplish for a cell that was already planning something much larger? That question, that very specific question, is the thread you pull to unravel everything. Let me tell you about the Mossad operation first, because it is genuinely impressive, and because understanding what it got right is the only way to understand what it missed entirely. The 7 Israelis who were taken had connections. One of them had a cousin who worked in the Israeli Foreign Service. Within hours of the disappearance, the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires had activated its emergency protocols. Within 12 hours, Jerusalem had information that this was not random. Mossad's station in Buenos Aires, which, like all Mossad stations in South America at the time, operated under diplomatic cover and maintained a network of local assets, began working the problem from 2 directions simultaneously. First, Argentine police contacts. There were payments. There were favors called in. There were very specific conversations between men who did not write anything down. Second, signals intelligence. Israel's Unit 8200, the signals collection arm, was already monitoring certain communications channels in Argentina, not because of this kidnapping, because of the embassy bombing 2 years earlier. The investigation into that attack had never officially closed. The monitoring never officially stopped. Within 24 hours, Mossad had a location. A safe house in the Palermo neighborhood, a rented property, 3 guards, the 7 Israelis in a basement room. The operation to extract them was not a military raid. There were no commandos rappelling from helicopters. This was intelligence work, meaning it was messier, more human, and more dependent on things going right that nobody could fully control. 3 Argentine intermediaries, paid assets, not ideological allies, approached the safe house under a pretext. There was a negotiation. There was money. There was a moment, according to accounts that emerged years later, when it almost went wrong, when one of the guards reached for something and then didn't. The 7 Israelis were in the Israeli embassy within 36 hours of their disappearance. It was, by any measure, a success, a clean extraction. No Israeli casualties, no diplomatic incident. The Argentine government was quietly informed. The story was kept out of the press for several days at Israel's request, then leaked in a way that made Israel look competent and the kidnappers look like amateurs, which is exactly what the kidnappers wanted people to think. Here is the detail that changes everything. When the safe house was searched, after the fact, discreetly by Argentine intelligence officers who were working with Mossad, they found the camera, the one on the tripod, the one that had been pointed at the hostages for 36 hours. No tape inside. Not a tape that had been removed. Not a tape that had been used and wiped. No tape had ever been loaded. Think about that. You kidnap 7 people. You set up a camera in front of them. You tell them, implicitly, that you are going to record them. Maybe a proof of life video. Maybe an execution. The camera is part of the threat. The camera is how you make people afraid, but you never turn it on. Why? There are 2 possible explanations. The first is incompetence. These were low-level operators who grabbed the props without knowing how to use them. The second is that the camera was never meant to record anything, because recording was never the point. The intelligence officers who reconstructed this years later, long after the AMIA bombing made them go back and look at everything, came to a disturbing conclusion. The kidnapping was a probe, not an extortion attempt, not a politically motivated hostage situation, a test. a test of Mossad's response time, a test of Israeli intelligence's penetration of Argentine law enforcement, a test of which channels activated, how fast, and who showed up. If that analysis is correct, and there are serious intelligence professionals who believe it is, then the rescue was not a victory. The rescue was the experiment reaching its conclusion. The kidnappers got everything they needed. They found out that Mossad had assets inside Argentine police. They found out that Israel could locate a safe house in less than 24 hours. They found out which specific channels were being used, and then they adjusted. 4 months later, the AMIA bombing was carried out with a method that exploited precisely those gaps. A truck bomb delivered to a target that had not been the subject of signals monitoring. An operational cell that had compartmentalized away from any channels that Israel had previously penetrated. A strike so fast, so complete, that there was no window for the kind of human intelligence operation that had saved the 7 tourists in March. 85 people killed, 300 wounded. The deadliest attack on the Jewish diaspora since the Holocaust. And here is the question that intelligence professionals do not like to answer in public. The question that I am going to ask you to sit with, because this is the uncomfortable part. This is where you have to decide what you actually believe about how intelligence agencies work and what they owe the people they are supposed to protect. Did anyone connect the two events before the bombing? The answer, based on everything that has emerged from investigations over the following 3 decades, is probably not. Not in the way that would have mattered. There were fragments, a name here, a surveillance photograph there. The Argentine DAIA, the Jewish community's representative body, had raised concerns in the months after the embassy bombing about ongoing threat levels. Mossad's Buenos Aires station filed reports. Reports were read. Analyses were written. But the kidnapping in March, the clean, successful, celebrated rescue, was filed under a different category. It was resolved. It was over. Intelligence agencies have a structural weakness that mirrors a very human weakness. They remember their failures and close the file on their successes. The safe house in Palermo went into the win column. Nobody went back and asked why the camera was empty. Now I need to tell you about Iran and Hezbollah, because without that architecture, the rest of this story doesn't make sense. And this is the part that most English-language coverage of the AMIA bombing either oversimplifies or gets politically squeamish about. By 1994, Hezbollah had been Iran's primary external operational arm for more than a decade. The relationship was not a proxy relationship in the way that word is usually used, as if Hezbollah were a puppet receiving orders. It was more sophisticated than that and more dangerous. Hezbollah had its own institutional interests, its own intelligence apparatus, its own operational culture. What Iran provided was money, training, logistics, and, critically, the protection of Iranian diplomatic infrastructure in countries where operations were being planned. Buenos Aires had a significant Lebanese Shia community. It had Iranian diplomatic personnel who were, as multiple investigations later established, not primarily engaged in diplomacy. The Iranian cultural attaché at the time of the AMIA bombing was later named as a person of interest by Argentine prosecutors. The mastermind of the attack, according to Argentine and international investigations, was Imad Mugniye, Hezbollah's head of special operations, a man who had been responsible for the Beirut barracks bombing in 1983, for the TWA hijacking in 1985, for the kidnapping of Western hostages in Lebanon throughout the 1980s. Mugniye was not in Buenos Aires. He didn't need to be. That's what cells are for. The cell that carried out the AMIA bombing was assembled slowly, carefully, over months. Some members had been in Argentina for years under legitimate cover. Others arrived closer to the operation. The truck, a Renault traffic van loaded with approximately 300 kilograms of ANFO explosive and ammonium nitrate, was acquired locally. The driver was a young man named Ibrahim Hussein Barrow, 29 years old, from a village in southern Lebanon. He had family members who had died in Israeli operations. He was told he would be doing something important for his people. He drove the truck into the entrance of the AMIA building at 9:53 in the morning on July 18, 1994. The building collapsed inward. You remember the cold open, the camera on the tripod, the one that was never turned on. Here is what that image actually means. It means that somewhere in the operational planning of the AMIA bombing, there is a data point that reads, Israeli intelligence response time in Buenos Aires, under 24 hours. Argentine police assets compromised at the following levels. Safe house operational security, penetrated via human intelligence, not signals. It means that when the AMIA cell finalized its operational plan, they knew what they were up against. They planned around it. They chose a target, a Jewish community center, not an Israeli government building, specifically because Jewish community targets were not under the same surveillance umbrella as diplomatic or government facilities. They chose a method, a truck bomb, that allowed no time window for the kind of human intelligence operation that had worked in March. They studied the rescue, and they used it. I want to be very careful here about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that the March kidnapping was definitely a deliberate probe by the AMIA bombing cell. Intelligence historians disagree about this. Some believe the kidnapping was organized by a separate group with separate goals, and the connection to the AMIA attack is correlation rather than operational planning. Some believe the kidnappers were affiliated with Hezbollah, but not with the specific cell that carried out the July attack. What I am claiming, what the evidence supports, is this. The rescue, in its success, may have taught the enemy more than it taught us. That is not a comfortable thing to say about something that saved 7 lives. Those 7 people went home to their families. They sat at Shabbat tables. They held their children. That is real, and it matters. I am not diminishing it, but Jewish history has a long, painful tradition of counting the people who survived without asking what happened to the ones who came after. We count the Exodus out of Egypt, and we don't always talk about what happened to the generation that didn't make it to Canaan. We celebrate the Hanukkah miracle, and we don't always teach what happened to the Jews of Judea in the century after the Maccabees. The Buenos Aires Jewish community celebrated a rescue in March of 1994. In July, 85 of them died. And the Argentine government, which had financial relationships with Iran, which had intelligence indicating ongoing threat levels, which had received reports from Mossad about activity in Buenos Aires, did not prevent it. This is where the story becomes something beyond an intelligence failure. This is where it becomes something that Jewish communities around the world should understand about the difference between a country that is home and a country that is residence. Argentine Jews had built something extraordinary. 250,000 people, generations deep. Synagogues, schools, newspapers, community centers, the AMIA itself. They had done everything right, integrated, contributed, built civic lives, engaged with Argentine democracy. They had every reason to trust that the state would protect them. The state failed them. Not out of indifference alone. The investigation into the AMIA bombing, which is still officially open 30 years later, revealed levels of obstruction that go beyond failure. Cover-ups, witnesses pressured, evidence mishandled. Argentine prosecutors who pursued the Iranian connection were undermined by government officials with financial interests in maintaining relationships with Tehran. In 2013, former President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner signed a memorandum with Iran that would have subjected the Argentine investigation to a joint Argentine-Iranian commission, effectively giving Iran oversight of an investigation into an attack Iran had ordered. The Argentine Supreme Court later struck down the memorandum. One of the prosecutors who continued pursuing the Iranian connection, Alberto Nisman, was found dead in his apartment in January of 2015, the night before he was scheduled to present evidence to Congress. His death was ruled a suicide. The investigation into his death has never been resolved. 30 years. No one has been extradited. No one has been tried. The people believed responsible are either dead. Imad Mughniya was killed in a car bombing in Damascus in 2008, widely attributed to Mossad and the CIA, or protected by Iranian state immunity, or unreachable. The 7 tourists from the parking garage in March are alive. Their names have never been published. They gave quiet testimony to investigators years later. They described the camera on the tripod. They described waiting, not knowing. They described being told they had 36 hours. They described how, in the basement, they could hear their captors talking. Not Arabic, not Farsi, Spanish, accented Spanish, Lebanese accented Spanish. The kind that comes from a community that has been in Argentina for a generation. The kind that knew the streets, knew the city, knew which neighborhoods to use and which to avoid. That detail, the Lebanese accented Spanish, is in the testimony. It was filed. It was noted by investigators. It was not connected to the AMIA cell until after July 18th. Here is what I believe this story is actually about. Not about Mossad's competence or incompetence. Not about Hezbollah's operational sophistication. Not about Iranian state sponsorship of terrorism, though all of those things are true and documented and important. This story is about the cost of a certain kind of institutional memory. Intelligence agencies remember their failures because failures produce inquiries, reports, reforms, accountability. But they close the file on their successes. Success is evidence that the system worked. You do not interrogate a system that produced a successful outcome. Except sometimes the outcome that looks like success is actually the information your enemy needed to kill 85 people 4 months later. And the Jewish community of Buenos Aires, which had done nothing wrong, which had every right to trust the systems designed to protect them, which had built a life in a city they called home, paid for that institutional blind spot with everything they had. We are taught to say, never again, and to mean something specific by it. The Holocaust, the gas chambers, industrial murder, and yes, never again, absolutely never again. But I think never again also has to mean something about the quieter failures, the missing tape in the camera, the report that was filed and not followed, the prosecutor who was never allowed to finish his work, the 30-year investigation that has never produced a single extradition. Never again has to include the accountability that makes it possible. For the Jewish community in Argentina, life after the AMIA bombing did not stop. That is the most Jewish thing I can tell you. They rebuilt. They mourned. They fought for justice through the courts, through international pressure, through the work of community organizations that have spent 3 decades demanding that the Argentine government answer for what it failed to prevent and what it actively obstructed. The AMIA building was rebuilt. It stands today on Pasteur Street in Buenos Aires. On the wall outside, there is a list of 85 names. Every year, on the 18th of July, Argentine Jews gather there. Not just Argentine Jews, Jews from around the world. The anniversary has become one of the most significant dates in diaspora Jewish memory. Not because the story is over, but because it is not. The men who built the bomb that killed 85 people were never brought to justice. The men who made that possible, in Tehran, in Buenos Aires, in offices where documents were shredded and witnesses were pressured, have, with a few exceptions, lived out their lives without legal consequence. That is the truth. I am not going to dress it in something more comfortable. But here is the other truth. The names on that wall are not forgotten. The investigation continues. The community that was targeted still exists, still fights, still names names in courtrooms and before international bodies, still insists on the full accounting that 30 years of obstruction has tried to prevent. That is also Jewish history. The part where we refuse to let the file close. 7 tourists in a parking garage in March. A camera on a tripod that was never turned on. 36 hours and a successful rescue that may have taught the enemy exactly what they needed to know. And 85 names on a wall in Buenos Aires. We remember them all.